Hi everyone, my name is Jenny and I'm back today to do another video. Today I'm going to be doing my review and discussion video for my African women writers pick for December, which was The Shadow King by Maza Mengiste. If you're unfamiliar with my African women writers project, I will have my announcement video as well as my last month's review and discussion video up in the cards above as well as in the description box below. Just a reminder, if you missed last month's video, I reviewed The Old Dress by Namole Serpell. Also a reminder, in case you are following along, in January I will have my last pick for this project, which will be How Beautiful We Were by Imbolo Mbui. Now this book does not come out until March of 2021, but as you can see I do have this early copy that I won in a giveaway, so I will have a review and discussion of this one in preparation for its release in March. So for a brief biography of Mengiste, she was born in Ethiopia in 1974. However, her and her family had to flee Ethiopia in 1978 due to the Ethiopian Revolution. She then spent the rest of her childhood in Nigeria, Kenya, and the United States, and she completed her MFA at New York University. Mengiste has been awarded a number of different awards, including a Fulbright to study in Italy, as well as a 2020 American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature. Her debut novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, tells the story of a family living through the Ethiopian Revolution in the 1970s. Her second novel, however, The Shadow King, was published in 2019 by W.W. Norton here in the United States, and as I'm sure many of you know, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2020. In this literary historical fiction novel, Mengiste aims to uncover the women's stories of the Italo-Ethiopian War that happened from 1935 to 1941. In this novel, we follow a multitude of characters, however those begin to fall away as we begin to track our two main characters, who are Harut, a young woman who is in servitude to who will become one of the main generals in the Ethiopian Resistance Army, as well as Etere, who's a Jewish Italian man who is fighting in the Italian forces and is also a photographer for the war. So he's documented a lot of the war and the war crimes for the Italian press as well as the Italian government. Let's just get into my guiding questions for this review. So my first question is always, what are the overall themes of this novel? And I think the primary goal of this novel is really to discuss war and its impacts on the psyche. So Mengiste really does not shy away from the horrors of war in this novel. In fact, much of the novel's focus is on the horrors of war and specifically how those are enacted and implemented on women's bodies specifically. These include rape, torture, and death, so definitely trigger warnings if any of those more graphic depictions of war and the outcomes of war are something that you do not feel comfortable reading. The Shadow King also focuses a lot of its attention, I think, on complicating the narrative surrounding war and discussing how no one in war is necessarily good or bad. There are people that are doing terrible things on both sides of any war, and there are people that suffer on both sides of any war. So I think Mengiste does a great job of, while we primarily focus on Harut, who actually is a victim of terrible things on both sides, both the Ethiopian side of the war and the Italian side of the war, we also see that all of these characters are struggling with questions of morality and what is right or wrong, especially in the context of war. Question number 2 is, how is colonialism or neocolonialism discussed in the novel? What role does it have in the narrative? This novel does not really touch on colonialism, in large part because Ethiopia was never a colony. So the Italian occupation of Ethiopia from 1935 to 1941 is the closest that Ethiopia has ever become to being a European colony. So that was not an aspect of Ethiopia's history covered in this novel, given that it never happened. So there was some discussion in this novel about imperialism more broadly and imperial projects, particularly in the framing narrative that takes place at the beginning of the end of this novel that is set in the 1970s during the Ethiopian Revolution, where we see that several Italian soldiers from the 1930s and 40s actually never returned to Italy, probably because of the authoritarian regime therein in Italy, that continued to live in Ethiopia through to the 1970s. And so we do see that some of those soldiers are obviously unwanted in Ethiopia, and that is a point of contention within the Ethiopian Revolution. So there is some minor discussion about imperialism, but it's not necessarily a primary focus of the novel in my mind. Question number 3 is, how are women featured in the narrative? Are they the main characters? Are they side characters? So this is a particularly interesting question as it gets a bit into kind of my personal thoughts about this book, particularly because I thought this would be more focused on women than I actually found it to be. So while the novel purports to be primarily about women in this conflict of war, the men and their perspectives, honestly, I believe dominate the narrative, and there's a lot of discussion about men's impacts on women and women's bodies that's present throughout the novel. However, we don't get as much of the women's perspectives as I really wanted to. Granted, we do hear from Harut, who's our main female character, quite a bit, and we do learn a lot about her and her motivations and her lack of agency within this war. I just was expecting a bit more about female soldiers personally within this narrative. But I will say, however, that I think that may have been intentional on Mengiste's part in describing the ways that women continue to lack agency, and again, as I've said previously, the specific ways that war impacts women and their bodies. Question number 4 is, how is history, particularly the history of families, discussed? And this novel, as with many war-centered stories in my mind, has quite a sense of presence to it, in that history, despite this moment likely having great historical significance in the future, it does not really feel that history is playing a part in the narrative, primarily because a war is such a in the moment present thing. So I think many of the characters, while their histories are very important to them and they have large ramifications for how they get treated in the war and what outcomes the war has for themselves and their families, and that's discussed quite a bit in the novel, at the same time it's a war, and so our people's histories and family backgrounds begin to fall away because they are in this war and they're either going to die or they're going to live. But there's such a sense of urgency that there's no kind of thinking about history and the ramifications of what is happening on history. However, on the flip side, I do think there's also quite a bit of discussion in this novel about the way that war is captured through memories, but also through physical items. There's a large section of this novel, given that Ettore is a photographer for the Italian army, that's talking about the photos he's taken of just some horrendous war crimes that the Italian army implemented against the Ethiopian, both armed forces but also civilians. And so there's a lot of discussion about how permanent those photographs are of understanding the horrors of this war, which I thought was really interesting, given that there is such a way in which we, particularly in the Western world, reimagine and remember wars that often are so different than actually the brutality and the horror that war provides. So I thought that was a great way of kind of establishing that war is not a positive thing, and that these war crimes do happen and we do have ways in which we can remember them that we choose to forget. Then question number 5 is, what are your overall thoughts on the novel? And this novel, despite being really thought-provoking and interesting, was quite hard for me to get through, in part because it's just incredibly dense. Mengiste is a beautiful writer, especially on a sentence-by-sentence level. There are so many passages in this book, as you can see from my tabbing, that I just thought were so beautiful. However, sometimes that makes a book harder to get through in my mind on like a paragraph-by-paragraph or chapter-by-chapter level. I also do find in general for me that war-centered stories are difficult to get through, which is in part why I was hesitant to pick this book up in the first place, but then since it was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, I thought I would give it a try. And yeah, I just don't really like reading about war. I don't find it, I find it just so like horrendous that these things, that people feel that even in a war it's okay to do these horrendously morally wrong things. And I do think while Mengiste is absolutely not justifying anything that happens in this book, in fact there's many events that are complicated pretty intensely, and the most villainous characters in this story definitely do get their due, which I found to be quite satisfying. It also just was really difficult to read because there's so much just horrific acts that are happening on the page. As I said, rape, torture, death, imprisonment, all of those things are happening in this book, and that obviously is very hard to read about. So those two things combined, I think the density of the text and also the subject matter, made this book quite a challenging book to get through. I did also find at the beginning it challenging to figure out exactly what was going on and what was the point of the story. I think the real kind of meat of the story didn't take place until about 2/3 / the last quarter of the book, and I found myself really engaging with that last quarter of the book, the last 100 pages or so, as I found there was a lot of interesting stuff there. But in the first 3/4, first 2/3, it was so focused on like military strategy and, as I said, the horrors of war, that I just wasn't as engaged with the book as I really wanted to be. I also found the framing device to be really fascinating, but at the same time it wasn't quite developed enough at the beginning for me to remember it as I was reading the text, of like why the interactions that we're seeing between our two main characters would become important, because I had totally forgotten what happened at the beginning of our framing story. So that was a bit frustrating, and I kind of wished that it had been made a bit more clear of like why this framing story was important, because it definitely tied everything together really nicely in the end of the novel. I also will say that I found the kind of titular aspect of the Shadow King to be really fascinating. I have no idea if it's a true story or not, but if it is, then that is super intriguing. I definitely do know that the emperor of the time was away from Ethiopia during much of this war. He had escaped to Britain, which happens in this novel, and that is somehow related to the Shadow King, but I don't want to give too much away aside from that. But I found that to be a really interesting military tactic that I was very intrigued about. So overall, I would say I did enjoy this novel and I would recommend it, particularly if you are more inclined towards stories that focus on a lot of these darker themes of war. But I only ended up giving it 3.5 stars just because it did drag so much for me at times, and also it just was so dense. So that is my review and discussion of The Shadow King by Mahsa Mengiste. If you are new to my channel through this video, I'd love to have you stick around and subscribe. Additionally, if you've read The Shadow King and you have any thoughts about what I've talked about in this video, or other thoughts that I didn't talk about in this video, please do let me know down in the comment section below. Additionally, if you are now interested in reading The Shadow King, also let me know down in the comment section below. I hope you're having a great rest of your day whenever you're watching this, and do know that if you're watching this on the day that I post it, that I actually will be posting 4 videos in the next 4 days. So this will be the start of a 4-day video spree. Tomorrow will be my second installment of Vlogmas. Monday will be my Reading Women 2021 challenge plans, and Tuesday will be my January to March 2021 anticipated releases video. So do look out for those 4 videos if you're watching this shortly after I post it. If you're watching it much later after I've posted it, then all those videos will be up on my channel. I hope you're having a great day, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.